Which platform should you make games for? I'm going to talk about 3 things to consider coming up. What's going on, guys? My name is Tim Ruswick, and today we're going to talk about which platform should you make games for. We're going to talk about specific platforms. We're going to go into some simple concepts about each one and which one you should choose. This comes as a request from one of our fellow recruits in Game Dev Underground, and they wanted me to talk about how do you know which platform to develop for. And so I think there are 3 primary things that I would say when you're considering which platform you want to develop for. At least these are the questions that I asked myself. I'm sure there's plenty of data and all kinds of other stuff if you wanted to get super analytical on which platform is actually the best. But I think these are the things that I go through when I figure out, okay, what kind of game am I going to make? Because I make HTML5 games. That's my favorite technology. So that means that by nature, I can make games for any platform I want. So which platform to choose is actually a pretty relevant question for me. So my process is like this. First, I look on the type of game that you want to make. Not all games work well on all platforms. For example, shooters work really well on PC. Runners work really well on mobile. Puzzle games work really well on mobile. You got to look at the type of game you want to make and look at the platform that you're using, because the input device is really important in how you control the game. Platformers, I really like to play on console. I really like to play with controller, but they're just as fine on PC. So for me, I don't really see a difference with specific game types. Like for that specific genre, you got to look at the game you want to make and look at not only what kind of input device your platform has, and because touchscreen is obviously a very different input device than a controller. But you also got to look at your target market. Like, where is it at? Like, a lot of people don't realize that, like, the average age of PC gamers is 38. That mobile games is mostly women, right? Like, a lot of people don't realize these specific demographics, and sometimes the type of game that you're making needs to be tailored to a specific platform specifically because it's made for a specific type of person. So you got to do research. You got to look up specific platforms. For example, if you know you're making a puzzle game and you know the game is primarily going to appeal to women, I would look at actual demographics and actual statistics for the specific platforms, and then make a choice off of that. But I think that's the first thing to take into account, right? The type of game. The second is the ease of accessibility. And what I mean by that is sometimes it may be better to make a console game for Xbox or PlayStation. Both of them have indie development programs, but both of them, their programs are a pain in the ass, and it's complicated to get into those programs and publish and do all that stuff. So whereas if you want to make a PC game, like Steam Direct is super simple, especially now you don't even have to go through all the bullshit with Steam Greenlight. Like, you can just pay your $100 and get up there, assuming you have a decent game and all that. But so the ease of accessibility is really important, because as developers, as independent developers, as sometimes solo developers, you don't have all that time and all that crazy like effort to worry about all these little fucking shit details, right? Like, I know when I was making mobile games, all of my mobile games on Android would work just as well on iOS, but iOS is such a pain in the ass to develop for. And since a lot of my games were free, like, I don't even want to publish on iOS to go through all that pain in the ass, and then they'll cancel the shit, they'll reject it and tell me to change 10,000 things, whatever. So it depends on what's important for you, but the type of game is important, ease of accessibility is important. Third thing you have to take into consideration is, do you really even need to make a choice? So a lot of engines these days, they're multi-platform. They allow you to export to all these different platforms. I know for me, HTML5 specifically, I don't have to really make a choice on which platform I create on, because I create on all of them by default. I can export to browser, I can export to desktop, I can export to Android, iOS. I can even go on consoles if I wanted to. So I think the question you should be asking yourself isn't necessarily which platform do you want to develop for. It's which platform do you want to develop for first. And that's a more important question, especially in the multi-platform realm, because developing for a specific platform first, you can gauge the response. You can see if the game works. You can try out your marketing. If the game starts to gain traction, then porting out to these different platforms is relatively easy, and it's worthwhile. And you can, not only that, but from a marketing perspective, you can tag on press releases and events and use those as excuses to reach out to your email list, and each one of these platforms is like an excuse to blast out your marketing message again and get in front of people's eyeballs again. So that's just something you really need to ask yourself. Like, do you really even need to choose, right? Like, sometimes just making whatever's easier is the best route. And that's what I would say. So out of those three things, figure out the type of game, figure out the ease of accessibility for you to actually develop on, and then figuring out if you really need to choose. I think if all things are equal, I would develop whatever's easiest for you. For me, that happens to be browser and Android. Those are just really easy platforms for me to develop on. They don't have any rules. They're not strict. Like, I can control everything I want to do. So for me to develop on those platforms is really simple, really straightforward. I can get my game out there, and then if things work out, then I can expand on the other platforms pretty easily, right? And like I said, my approach to games is a little different than other people's. I like to rapid prototype. I like to make games quickly, see what works. If something works, then I iterate on it and build on it. So for me, the ease of accessibility is really important for which platform I choose. So I would just say, if you look at those three things, you really can't go wrong. Developing is almost always going to be easier on like a PC, because you usually develop on a PC. So just by default, most games will work if you develop them. And then also, like, if you keep in mind that you can use these engines that are multi-platform, right? Like, I don't really think there is any benefit to going native, like going Android native or iOS native, outside of a speed increase. And the only way you really need a speed increase, or you're trying to do something crazy unique that engines just can't handle, which I think is very rare. But the speed increase is always something you can iterate out towards, right? Like, I know Color Switch, David, the developer of Color Switch, he started with BuildBox. It was a really cool, small little prototype. He built the game out in this HTML5 platform, and then from there, he wrote it natively because he needed a speed increase. He wanted to build the game better. He had all these little pieces. But by then, he had the success, he had the demand for it, so it made sense to develop natively. You don't got to start there. You could start with something that goes everywhere, right? And sometimes you don't even need to change that. There are plenty of games that don't need to change their coding at all. They can start with the technology is so good these days. You really don't need to choose. So I would say PC is probably always easiest by default, but you got to keep in mind the type of game you're making, the ease of accessibility, and then figuring out if you really even need to make a choice. But all things equal, like I said, I would go with whatever's easiest, and then you can expand out. I don't think that... I think the type of game is going to matter, right? Like, if you try and do a shitty Flappy Bird clone on PC, it's probably not going to go over very well. But outside of that, like, the demographics, I wouldn't make a decision on those specific numbers, at least at first, because I think you can always change platforms, you can always expand, you can always go multi-platform after you've went single platform. So I just think it's something that it comes down to preference and type of game mostly. So I hope that helped. If it did, please leave a comment below. Love to hear from you guys, and tell me what your favorite platform is, because I'm curious what you guys like to develop for. Once again, I'm Tim Ruswick, and I'll see you guys next time.